This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovators Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome to Killer Innovations. I'm your host, Phil McKinney. We are back here in the studio this week. We are still on the road traveling, so if you see us out and about or you want to track what we're doing, you can hop on over onto the Facebook page for the Killer Innovation Show, and I'll be posting updates from the road. We are out in the road over the holiday season this year, actually interviewing entrepreneurs and innovators in what I would call the more rural areas. First up will be Paducah, Kentucky, the hot spot of the U.S. We found some really interesting entrepreneurs there and some really interesting local activities around economic development. So that's what we're up to during our holiday season this year. But here in the studio today, we actually have a guest, Sharon Weinberger. Sharon has just recently written a book about DARPA. Sharon has a journalism background, but it's an interesting perspective. If you're a regular follower of the show, you know I've written some blog posts on DARPA, and I've been a big fan, but have also pointed out some of the where I think not just DARPA, but the government has pulled back from its investment in support of innovation. But we've brought Sharon on to talk about her book, but also to get her perspective because she's been covering DARPA for quite some time. So Sharon, thanks for joining us today on Killer Innovations.
Hey, Phil, thanks for having me.
So give us a little bit of background. You've got a journalism background and have actually covered the government, DARPA, and other activities in D.C. So give us a little bit of context of your background.
Sure. I fall into this little bit of a weird niche between national security journalism and science journalism. I've been writing about the science and technology of national security since about 2000. And when I first went into journalism writing about these issues, one of the things that I noticed was that national security journalists tend to focus on military operations. They want to write about wars. And science journalists have tended to stay away from military topics for a couple reasons. One, the focus of science journalism, certainly within the United States, is often on fundamental breakthroughs. Academic science tends to look down at times on military-funded science, particularly if it's science funded within the government laboratory system. And also, I think it's very frustrating for science journalists to deal with the Department of Defense, where you call 10 times and you can't get an interview. They're used to picking up the phone and calling journalists. But I became fascinated by this area. The Pentagon is historically one of the largest funders of science and technology in the country. It's changed the direction of science and technology. And so I was just always fascinated by this area and the people I interviewed, and more importantly, how science in the national security state functions. How does it function differently than in industry or academia? And that's the perspective I come from.
So do you have a technology background, or is it just a natural curiosity thing for you?
No, I'm more of a natural curiosity. My background, like a lot of journalists, isn't even in journalism. It's in international relations and political science. I was part of the old Russian East European studies contingent that, went away and is now coming back in style. But I first got very interested in this issue after graduate school when I went to work as a researcher and writer for, of all things, a defense company. And they were doing studies for the Department of Defense. And one of the studies I was assigned as a lead to was to look at the Department of Defense laboratory infrastructure. And so they sent me around the country interviewing directors and scientists at these military labs, essentially to say, what are you doing and why are you doing it? And the answers just baffled me.
Yeah. It was interesting. I have a little bit of a background. You and I were talking before the start of the show today, that I used to live in D.C., lived there for 13 years. But way back early in my career, I got involved with certain three-letter agencies. My background is in high-speed pattern recognition. So I was part of a startup company out of Chicago called ThumbScan Biometrics. This is back in 1985, 1986. So certain three-letter agencies were very interested in it. And then was my first introduction to these national labs. And back then, you go around and you're looking at what's some of the work that's going on in these labs, and you're like, oh my gosh, some of the stuff is like mind-blowing. And many of it in the national labs struggle with how to get it out of the lab and get people to actually do anything with it.
Yes. I mean, the national labs, but, the Department of Energy sponsored labs, the nuclear labs, and then, of course, on the other side, the DoD labs, they struggle with many things. They struggle with many great innovations and how to get them out. They struggle that sometimes the basic science they do isn't as good as what's done in academia. And they struggle with the very closed nature of the system and how classification affects science and technology innovation. So they have these sort of multi-layered struggles that are fascinating, but it's a lot of money and it's very important. It
is very important. And in fact, I testified in front of the Senate, late 80s, I guess it was, on a article that I wrote with regards to government-funded research at universities and the lack of transfer out of that research. What was the ultimate impact? And I was affiliated with the University of Illinois. I'd done a couple of spin-off companies of taking technologies out of U of I and launching those. But University of Illinois ranked in the top 10 of government dollars received, yet ranked like 197 in licensing and commercialization of that research. And it's hard. It's like incredibly hard. I mean, I spent a lot of time at Oak Ridge. For some reason, fingerprint biometric and supercomputer research is big at Oak Ridge National Labs. And so I spent a lot of time at Oak Ridge, and you see these phenomenally brilliant, smart people, and they can't commercialize it. But what I found also, tell me, because I come, having been CTO at Hewlett Packard and HP Labs, 300 PhD researchers, incredibly smart. We were lucky if we got 1% of any of the projects at HP Labs commercialized. And that's in business. It's not any different.
Yeah. I mean, I remember visiting Oak Ridge Lab probably about 10 years ago, and they had this little sort of museum of things that they were able to commercialize. And it was almost quite sad and funny. It was like the smallest, weirdest, most and again, they do great science there and great technology, but the things they commercialized were just bizarrely small and almost irrelevant.
Yeah, well, it is really interesting. Back in the 80s when we were doing work with the agencies and with Oak Ridge and whatever, we were one of the early companies to do the first of the CRADAs, the cooperative R&D, right?
Oh, yes.
Under with, and then also in support of what work at the university with the Dole Act to try to encourage universities to commercialize government-funded research, et cetera. And and actually, it's you coming on the show. I kind of sat back because I haven't really been involved in the government work for so long. I'm like, has it gotten any better?
I think it's gotten different. I would not say better. I think what government struggles with is, every few years they relook at this problem, the small business innovative research contracts, the CRADAs. How do we commercialize what the government does? And the irony is, I think that the best things that have been done have almost been by accident rather than by design. When government starts to think about trying to transition technologies, they sort of layer program upon program and come up with metrics that often don't mean anything.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because it's one of the big topics we've had on the show here over the last 14 years, right, is what's the right metric, right? Be careful what you measure because you will lead people to do bad things.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in a way, I think metrics are the worst part of how to measure innovation because then it becomes a scoring game rather than really about what you're trying to achieve. One of the things I struggled with the DARPA book is, thinking about the agency's legacy. How do you measure whether the agency is successful? And every few years, DARPA itself has commissioned a report, how many of our projects have transitioned, what impact have they had? And again, those scores are meaningless. We don't think of DARPA as successful because 85 or 90% of its projects or 5% or 10% failed or didn't fail. We think DARPA is successful because there are things we use in our everyday lives, like the internet that came out of DARPA. I don't know how you score that.
Well, that's it. Is it you cleared a gate, or is it really by impact? And then how do you measure impact? Right. Yeah. This is a little bit of my frustration, having been leading R&D and innovation at a very large organization, and Wall Street measures it by R&D spend as a percentage of revenue, and it's absolutely non-predictive of innovation success. It's an absolutely bogus metric. And It's one, though, that Wall Street imposes on publicly traded companies. You have to use this metric when you do your 10Q reports, and it's stupid. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to pick up our conversation with Sharon Weinberger, talking about her work and her look at DARPA and government research, but we're going to dig also into her new book, so don't go anywhere. This is great stuff. Gives you some great insight and some great ideas. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this quick commercial break. You're listening to Killer Innovations on the BizTalk Radio Network.
This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovators Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome back to Killer Innovations. Before we hop into this segment, need to do a quick shout out to one of our sponsors. Today's sponsor for the show is Zoom. Zoom has actually been a long-time sponsor for Killer Innovations. It's a tool technology that we use every day. Bringing our guests in for the show, using it in my day job as a CEO, staying connected with my team, scattered literally all over the world. It's a tool that I could not be successful without. Now, a lot of us have tried video collaboration technologies and communications tools or whatever, but I'll tell you, the one metric that I use is Zoom is the first video collaboration technology that doesn't suck. So try it out. You can get your free account. Hop on over to killerinnovations.com/Zoom. That account will allow you to collaborate with up to 50. That's right, 50 people. So you can try it out with your team, see how it works, and believe me, once you try it, you will not go back. You will be hooked all over Zoom. So check it out and hop on over to Zoom. Also, let them know that you heard about it here on Killer Innovations. That helps us out. And again, try it out, killerinnovations.com/Zoom. So, Sharon, let's pick up the conversation here. Your book has just recently come out, The Imagineers of War, which I thought was a kind of a very interesting title. The Untold Story of DARPA, the Pentagon agency that changes the world. Now, some of our listeners, about half of our listeners are based here in the U.S., half of them are outside the U.S. I'm sure many people know DARPA, but some may not. Give us a little background context for DARPA.
Sure. So DARPA is an agency that was formed in 1958, authorized by President Eisenhower as a direct response to the Soviet Union's launch of Sputnick, the world's first artificial satellite. There's a lot of mythology that has sort of developed around Sputnik over the years, and it sparked this immediate panic, a little more political than that. But it is safe to say that within a few weeks, there was this incredible political controversy that the United States was falling behind in the space race, behind in education, behind in military technology. And some of that, there were elements of truth in it. A lot of it was overblown, but it was a political crisis in Washington. So Eisenhower decided to consolidate all of the space programs, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, to include Wernher von Braun and the German rocket scientists who've been taken from Germany and installed in Huntsville, Alabama. And it was all put under this new agency in February 1958, called at the time the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA. So even before NASA, the first space agency, actually DARPA, or ARPA at the time, was the first space agency with the goal of getting the United States into space. And that is the origins of where it came from.
And so, DARPA has been around for quite some time. It's had, kind of its ups and downs. We know of it from the standpoint of some of the big projects that have had big impact, like, the internet, which started off as ARPANET, really is a way to drive collaboration amongst institutes doing research. What are some of the other things that maybe people aren't as aware of as projects that have kind of gotten birthed out of DARPA?
Sure. I think one of the most significant ones that's forgotten because it doesn't seem as sexy these days as ARPANET and the internet. DARPA, in its very first years, pioneered a nuclear test detection system. Basically, they modernized the field of seismology by building these seismograph stations around the world, enabling nuclear test detection, which gave birth to the modern era of arms control, like the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And as part of that, because they were modernizing and pouring money into the field of seismology, they actually changed that entire academic field. And the data from those seismograph stations helped prove plate tectonic theory and the publications that came out of it. Not necessarily as sexy these days as the internet, but this was a tremendous impact that DARPA had in its early days.
Well, I think you bring up a good point, right? It's also, in many cases, it's a second order effect, right? They were trying to solve the problem of nuclear detection, but it has this huge, long tail of impact and, just changing the whole face of science in certain areas.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, let's take the case of ARPANET, the predecessor to the internet. The assignment was given to DARPA to do something with command and control. Harold Brown, who went on to become the Secretary of Defense, but was then a senior technology official in the Pentagon, said he gave this assignment to DARPA because he was thinking about command and control of nuclear weapons. He wasn't thinking about institutes collaborating with each other. But the person that they hired to run this new office at DARPA, J.C.R. Licklider, a psychologist with an interest in computers, had a much broader vision. He saw the way that computers and people's interaction with computer was going to revolutionize the world. And he started putting in place a program for computer networking. So as you said, second order effects.
Yeah, Licklider, I've read a number of books on him and read his papers. The guy, given that he doesn't have a technology background, but he had that ability to kind of see beyond and create the right structure to a challenge that just ignited passion from his teams. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, he had this very messianic vision, and he was a proselytizer. I mean, so many people that I interviewed from the early days of DARPA said they hadn't really thought about computers the way he did, but he would give these lectures. He would bring in DARPA scientists. And, there was this one demonstration done in the early 1960s at a hotel by the Pentagon where he tried to show people this is what personal computing will look like in the future. And you might be downloading recipes, in your kitchen. And people, they couldn't even conceive of it before he talked about it.
Yeah, totally discounted from the standpoint of you get a little bit too far out and you get discounted. But I think in hindsight, he's a name that most people don't know, but exactly. His vision has impacted majority of the world's population every day.
Yeah, it's interesting that he's certainly well known, I think, among people, sort of historians of computer scientists and people who have an interest in the history of science and technology. But, he's an unknown beyond that world, which is really one of the great misfortunes of history.
Well, and it's not, I think it's also, we'll talk more about this in the next segment of the show, but, there's probably a lot of these hidden, big successes that people just don't know about, where DARPA's had such huge impact on business, science, medicine, policy that people just don't know about.
Oh, yeah. Another area that DARPA really isn't given a lot of credit for is the emerging field of brain-computer interface. Basically, devices controlled directly by neural signals came directly out of DARPA research starting in the 1970s.
Yeah, and that's actually another good example of being so far out there, because no business could be out as far ahead as DARPA is, and then it just kind of creates this vacuum that brings investment capital, business support, research support, students, etc. So stay right there. We're going to be right back after this quick commercial break, continuing our conversation with Sharon Weinberger on her book, The Imagineers of War, The Untold Story of DARPA, the Pentagon agency that changed the world. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this quick commercial break. You're listening to Killer Innovations on the BizTalk Radio Network.
This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovators Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome back to Killer Innovations. Before we hop back into the show, I want you to do a quick shout out to one of our sponsors, HP. Now, you've been a regular listener to the show, you're probably rolling your eyes going, hold on, Phil, you used to work for HP, and that is the case. HP's been a sponsor for the show now coming up almost on a year. They've been providing all the technologies in the studio for us, which has allowed us to produce the show that we make available to you free of charge. But HP also, through their support, is also supporting some of the nonprofits that we're involved in particularly Hacking Autism, which actually started at HP. Hacking Autism focuses on helping people on the autism spectrum both find work, find better access to therapies and technologies to help people on the spectrum. If you're interested in looking up more about hacking autism, you can hop on over to hackingautism.org. If you want to see what we're doing with the HP gear here in the studio, hop on over to killerinnovations.com/HP, and you'll see all the gear and technologies that we're using here in the studio. And stay tuned. We actually have a new studio that's being built. And we'll be doing a full video tour of that studio. For some reason, you guys all like to really see behind the scenes how we make this all work. So we'll be doing that here relatively soon. So again, hop on over killerinnovations.com/HP. Sharon, let's talk a little bit about you. Your subtitle of your book is pretty interesting. The Untold Stories of DARPA, the Pentagon agency that changed the world. There's been a lot of articles and stories. There's even been videos, and there's been a lot of talk about DARPA. Are there really untold stories about DARPA?
Yes, and many more than I thought, even when I started the book. My hesitation when I first went into this is exactly like you said. I thought, well, I kind of know the history of DARPA. It was born in 1958. It did this and this, and it created that. And I was a little hesitant until I started doing the research when I discovered a few things. One, there were about 100 boxes of recently declassified materials at the National Archives and Records Administration, materials that had never been touched before. Actual memos that Licklider was writing back in 1962, actual memos of DARPA program managers in the field in Vietnam, classified programs no one had ever even heard of. And so there were literally untold stories. And then I also tracked down people going back to people who were employed at DARPA when the agency opened its doors in the Pentagon in 1958, and they had stories to tell. And then there was this entire hidden history of this seminal figure at DARPA, an intelligence operative who ended up going to prison, who was so important to the foundations of the agency. And as often happens when someone goes to prison, it kind of been written out of history. So yeah, there were a lot of untold stories.
Okay, so now you've got me in. So 100 boxes. Did you go through all 100 boxes?
I went through the vast majority of them, and there are still many more boxes that are not yet declassified. I don't know if those are whole news stories or what's in them. Some of them I requested through the Freedom of Information Act to have reviewed and declassified. So let me give you one small example of a small but important story that came out of these boxes, something called Project Star. It was an emergency top secret project assigned to DARPA just a couple days after President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Texas, where they suddenly realized we didn't have technology to protect the president. That was part of the problem. He was just driving along in an open car. And so DARPA, as this military science and technology agency, was assigned this project to come up with technologies to protect the president, and they went to work coming up with ideas. Unfortunately, many ideas of DARPA are very good. This project did not produce a lot of great ideas. My favorite was the non-lethal squirt gun.
The non-lethal squirt gun. Okay. So, in the fact of the untold stories, what did you have as your kind of mission of telling the DARPA story? Is it to kind of poke the government to kind of reinvest, or is it just to tell a good story, or to inspire? What was the real premise behind the book?
here's my theory of the world. We as people make sense of ourselves through narrative, through story. We tell a story about our lives. Well, so do agencies. And DARPA's story is it was born as a space agency, had this incredible story of innovation, and it's wonderful. And there are elements of truth in that. What I wanted to ask is, what is DARPA's legacy? Like, what has made it so successful? I do think it's incredibly successful, but is it as successful as it claims to be? And if so, why? And I think that answer best comes through a narrative, and most importantly, through the parts of the narrative that have been left out. I think the biggest gap in that narrative is the role of William Goodell, this intelligence operative who went to prison, who really set DARPA on its course, ironically, for innovation in ways that nobody ever thought really happened.
Okay, so what's his story, and why is he? Because he's not a name I've ever heard, and I've read a lot about DARPA. And he went to prison, and he was an intelligence operative. So what's his story?
He was one of the first employees of DARPA back when it was founded in 1958. And he was basically put there by the intelligence community because part of DARPA's creation was sweeping up all of the space programs to include a classified program called Corona, which became the first Earth imaging satellite. And so Goodell was sort of put there because there was a lot of spy money involved. And when the space mission was taken away from DARPA, the first director quit in disgust because he really saw DARPA as a space agency. And that basically left this intelligence operative, William Goodell, as sort of the man in de facto control. And he looked around at the world and he said, I see a new mission for this agency. We have problems with the Soviet Union, but I don't see a nuclear exchange in the next few years. I see the rise of insurgencies in places like Southeast Asia, and that's where we should bring our technology to bear, is in proxy wars and in Vietnam.
Interesting. So in effect, because of the formation of NASA, he pops up as having been defining the charter, in effect, for DARPA in the early days.
He defined the charter, and in ways that even the current DARPA doesn't quite understand his impact. So he created this very ambitious program in Vietnam, which in the 1960s was the third largest program in DARPA. You basically had missile defense, nuclear test detection, and then Vietnam. And he started a jungle combat center, developing everything like silent aircraft to the first drones that were being sent to Vietnam. And after the Vietnam War ended, and that office needed to be closed down, Goodell had been sent to jail for fraud, I think unfairly, but that's an entire another story. And the director of DARPA said, we need to find a way to hide this office from Congress, to save the technologies. And so this director renamed it the Tactical Technology Office. That office today, which is a direct legacy of Vietnam, is the largest, most successful office at DARPA. It is what produced things like stealth aircraft and drones that we so closely associate with DARPA today.
Amazing. I mean, like you said, though, that is the untold story. Because, like I said, I've read lots of books about DARPA, but there are these characters that are hidden, and I think this actually plays into a little bit about just DARPA in general. We talked about this earlier in the show about lots of things that impact our day-to-day lives that we just don't even know originated from within DARPA.
Yeah, and this goes also to a bigger lesson that I draw out of the book, which is I think there's the impression of DARPA today as this sort of nifty science fiction agency. But in reality, the legacy of DARPA is as a science and technology agency that thinks about warfare. The fact that the most successful technologies out of DARPA derived from basically the Vietnam War tells us something, for better or for worse, about what drives innovation, which is problem solving. Vietnam was a big problem.
Well, and I think also what DARPA did quite successfully is define the problem and then partner to find the solution. Right? If you think about stealth aircraft work with the Skunk Works guys at Lockheed, or you think about the ARPA network and the work at universities like UCLA or University of Utah, those things, where DARPA, has great scientists, but they also recognize that there's this great capability of bringing industry to partner. And I think that becomes a little bit of the challenge going forward with some of these activities, because there's this barrier of collaboration becomes a real problem. When we come back from this commercial break, Sharon, I'm going to ask you to kind of give 2 or 3 key insights that you uncovered in your research on the book that the listeners can kind of maybe apply to their own thinking around innovation. And don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this quick break. If you've got a topic that you would like to have covered on an upcoming show, drop me a note at phil@killerinnovations.com, and we'll be back right after this break.
This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovators Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome back. We're going to hop right back in with Sharon. Hey, Sharon, at the end of the last segment, I asked you to think about what would be that advice from your research looking at DARPA that the listener could apply to their own thinking around innovation. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Sure. I do have 3. I think they're interrelated a bit. First is that the price of success is failure. And this is part of the lesson. DARPA likes to say we don't remember our failures, so we try things over and over. But I would come to a more subtle lesson that, yes, the failures matter. That DARPA has had some tremendous successes like ARPANET, but its legacy in Vietnam was very disastrous. And when you think about a legacy of success, you have to think about what were the results of these failures. So that's one. The second one for DARPA is that what problem are you trying to solve? There's a tendency to think of DARPA as this innovative agency, but that would just put out lots of successful technologies. What made it successful was it was a problem-solving agency for war. The scope of what you're trying to achieve, the mission matters. If you just created an agency and said, come up with good science and technology, I don't think you would get important innovations. And the third one for DARPA, which is I think related to that, is the function is more important than the form. There's a tendency in government these days, and maybe even in industry, you would know better to come up with a DARPA model. We're going to, arrange our chairs the way DARPA does. We're going to have short-term employees the way DARPA does. That is not what makes DARPA successful. That helps it. The lack of bureaucracy, the coming in and out of employees. What makes DARPA successful is that it is trying to solve the problems of warfare, that it has this very important mission that it's focused on, and then everything else feeds into it. Everything else makes it successful. The DARPA, you can't just take the DARPA model and put it at Google or Facebook or at the CIA. It has to have a mission. It has to have a customer, which in this case is the Pentagon.
Well, it's interesting, particularly on this function is more important than the form, right? There's literally 10,000 innovation consultants out there running around going, I've got this magic 10-step process, and if you follow this, magic happens, and it's bogus, right? It's you have to create what works for your organization, whether it's DARPA. What is your mission? What is your purpose? Why are you even doing innovation? And a lot of organizations are just doing, quote, innovation for innovation's sake.
Well, no, exactly. I mean, one of the biggest lessons I learned, one of my favorite DARPA directors from years past was this guy, Stephen Lukasik, who was the director in the 1970s. And when there was a sort of fad 10 years ago for creating DARPA replications in Homeland Security and the Department of Energy and the intelligence community. So these people started visiting him to take notes on management theory and what made DARPA successful. And he said, look around at my library. There's not a single management book here. There's not a management theory book. I don't think about management. I think about what problems I'm trying to solve. That is what he thought about. And that is really what drove the heart of success at DARPA.
And it's actually, I sit here and I think about it, if you look at, my background at HP, Dick Lampman, when Dick Lampman ran HP Labs, it wasn't around the form. It was, what's the big problems that's facing the computer industry, and how do we go attack those problems, and how do I bring the best and brightest?
Same thing at Bell Labs. Bell Labs in its heyday, the problems it was trying to solve in the big picture were the problems of the telecommunications industry. That is a big problem. There are a lot of technical challenges. So that I think that's one of the biggest lessons that I drive from DARPA.
So, hey, Sharon, as we wrap up this segment of the show, what is the best way for the listeners to keep track of what you're up to and what you're working on next?
Usually my Twitter feed these days, I have a pretty stagnant website. So Twitter is where I tweet out the articles I'm working on, that I'm editing, my thoughts of the day, if I have any. That's really where I kind of keep up to date on things.
And we'll put Sharon's Twitter feed up on the show notes at Killer Innovation, so therefore you can be able to follow her. Hey, Sharon, I really appreciate you taking the time to join us in today's show, and loving the stories today. And I would encourage listeners, go out and check out the book. Hop on over to Amazon. We'll have a link so you can find the book easily and check it out. DARPA's got, I think about historically an organization that people know about if you're in the innovation game, but probably don't really understand what was really the magic behind it, and like these untold stories. I mean, I've read a lot about DARPA, and I've heard stories today that I've just never have heard. So, Sharon, congratulations on I know what was probably a hard slog getting through and pulling this all together. So I wish you the best of luck on your book. So as we wrap up today's show, I want to take this time to give you a quick few updates. We will be at CES this year, so if you will be there and you want to meet, or we will also be there recording the show. So if you've got, or of somebody that's there who you think story should be heard by the listeners here at Innovations, just drop me a note, phil@killerinnovations.com. We'll get them on the schedule, or hey, we can just meet up and say hi while everybody's in Las Vegas in January. I also want to encourage you to hop on over and take a listen to Kim McNicholas' show, Kim on Innovation. She's been on this show many, many times. She's actually guest hosted this show. I've guest hosted her show. Kim and I actually have a new project that will be starting after the first of the year. I'll talk about more than that after January 1st. But if you don't know much about Kim, she's the former executive director of Sir Richard Branson's Extreme Tech Challenge and a former reporter from Forbes covering technology in Silicon Valley. Her show is on Fridays on KDOW in Silicon Valley. But her show is now up on the podcast. You can check that out over on iTunes and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Check out Kim's show. Great stuff. Great guests. With that, we're going to wrap up today's show. Appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to spend with us here. We're coming up on the next season in March. We will be announcing some stuff after the first of the year on getting ready for the new season launch and giving you a little bit of insight on what we're working on. But if you have ideas and suggestions or questions you just want to get answered on the show, just go ahead and again, just drop me a note. And that email address that I gave you comes directly to me. It doesn't get filtered through anybody. So as we close out, don't let the innovation antibodies get you down. Don't let somebody else dissuade you from going forward with your idea. Go out there and change the world. And we'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.